this lecture, we're going to be talking about two ways that the Roman nobility displayed its nobility, in the context of a funeral and in the context of a military triumph. We'll start by looking at Roman rituals surrounding death, and then look at the Roman funeral and the military triumph. So death in ancient Rome had a number of different interesting rituals around it, things that might seem a little bit unusual to us. One of the first of these is the fact that as a family member was lying on his or her deathbed, a close family member, a close relative, a sister, a brother, a husband, a wife, would kiss this dying individual. And the idea here was that they were catching the final breath. And with this final breath, that individual's soul. So the soul escaped into a close living relative rather than just flying out into the air. And this was an important ritual for the living family to know that they had preserved the soul of their dead family member. Also involved was the shouting of the individual's name. The name would be shouted 3 times successively, and the idea here was to ensure that they were actually dead. Now we can imagine that lacking all of the modern technology, they weren't actually entirely sure that this person was dead, that it was possible, for instance, that they'd fallen into a deep coma and were just breathing very, very shallowly. But there is some hope that when you shout someone's name 3 times, if they're just sort of weak and nodding off, that they'll wake up long enough to say, hey, I'm still here. At the moment of death, so when the death rattle comes, this was something that the Romans recognized, like other cultures that witnessed death firsthand. But when those final breaths were being taken, the individual would be placed on the ground. And this was a kind of reenactment of a ceremony that happened at birth, when the baby was placed on the ground and then raised up by the father in an acknowledgement of paternity. And now we have the individual going back to the ground, going back to Mother Earth. This is a kind of ashes to ashes moment. The body would be washed and embalmed and then displayed in the atrium of the house for a relatively short time, mostly. Usually 1 day, 2 days. They didn't want to display it too long. It would start to stink. They did have sophisticated embalming techniques, but not so sophisticated that it could withstand the heat of a Roman summer day. It's also at this time that a coin would be placed in the mouth of the corpse, and the point of this coin was to provide passageway across the river Styx. So this was payment to Charon, who rowed the boat across the river Styx. And so there would be a time of display where people would come, they would visit. It was the ancient equivalent of a wake, or of a viewing, if you've ever gone to a mortuary and seen the display of a body before the actual funeral and before the burial. And people could come, pay their respects, and it would happen in the room where the dead individual is surrounded by the masks of his ancestors. So is about to join those ancestors on the wall. And this was, again, a moment where the family members were able to display their nobility, where people came and they recognized that this individual was part of this much nobler and much longer family. So the funeral procession, it was an interesting ceremony, and it was a key ceremony for a noble family, and something that, while they were not happy to lose a family member, this was now an opportunity to display their nobility in public. Actors would be hired to wear the ancestor masks. They would be asked to dress in clothing that was similar to what the ancestors would wear, oftentimes just a toga, but sometimes it would be marked in a particular way to signify the honors that the ancestor had acquired in his own life. They would also imitate the gestures of the ancestor. So if the ancestor in speaking had particularly notable gestures, those would be imitated by the actors. The procession would go from the atrium of the private house through the city, and particularly passing through the city center, the Roman Forum, to wherever the family tomb was located outside the city walls. Actors would also be hired, or family members would provide lamentations. So there would be sometimes women hired to beat their breasts and tear their hair. And they would sing out sort of ululating, ooh, kind of lamentations. Instrumental music would accompany this, so flute players, lyre players, and so forth. So it's really, it was a massive spectacle in many respects. A eulogy would be performed, and this eulogy, which is called the Laudatio Funebris, or funerary praise, would be performed at the rostra in the Roman Forum, so on the orator's platform. This was the same place that the consul would give a speech, or other orators, lawmakers, and so forth. And this eulogy would be given by a male member of the family, and it was a real privilege to be given this opportunity, and sometimes it was even used as a kind of coming out on the political scene for a family member. But it was something that gave that family member the opportunity to praise the deeds of the dead man or woman, but also to, in essence, tie himself to that tradition. And so this eulogy was another important part of the whole spectacle. And on the left-hand side here, you have the example of frieze showing a funerary feast, which would happen at the tomb site, and food would be put into the tomb for the dead man. Little holes were left open so that you could push in food. And here we have an example of a funerary procession, also in a stone frieze, showing what it was, what it looked like in part. In essence, a kind of horse parade. Not entirely different if you've seen the televised state funerals. I'm thinking in particular of Ronald Reagan, but a kind of former president having a big state funeral with the parade down Washington Avenue. And here we have an example of another kind of imago on a sarcophagus. So this is the coffin that the dead would be placed in, and then sometimes placed in a tomb, but where the coffin would actually be displayed. People could see the decoration, and in the shield that the two little angel figures are holding is the image of the dead man, identifying him as the person held in this sarcophagus, and a mirror of the imago that would be at least in terms of the face, that would be displayed in the atrium. So the other major way that the nobility displayed its status to Rome, to other nobles, but also to the Roman masses, was through the performance of a military triumph. Obviously, there were many fewer opportunities to be the general triumphing than there were to participate in family funeral processions. But if you were given the opportunity to triumph, it was a glorious one. And in the image on the slide, on the left-hand side of your slide, you see some of what this spectacle looked like. Men on horseback, parading, troops following behind, walking through a triumphal arch of a former general. This was an amazing spectacle and privilege for a conquering general. Originally, the triumph was seen as a form of purifying the army, of cleansing it of the blood and gore of warfare, so that it could be reincorporated back into the Roman community, in essence, so that the soldiers and the general would lay down their arms and once again pick up the plow. It also was a way of thanking the gods. It was a ritual of thanksgiving. The gods were seen as being incredible supporters of the Roman army, and generals would often invoke the gods before they went out onto the battlefield. They would vow temples to these gods. So one of the ways that different gods were thanked, but especially Jupiter and Mars, is through the performance of a triumph. So originally it has these more almost religious origins, but eventually, and certainly by the 2nd century and into the 1st century, it is pretty straightforwardly just an opportunity for the glorification of a general and of his achievements. Oftentimes his achievements fighting in a foreign war, far away from the city of Rome, where a lot of Romans don't know about what was going on. It was the Senate that awarded triumphs, that decided which conquering generals got them, which feats merited them. So just because you defeated another army didn't mean that you got a triumph. In fact, the Senate was the one that decided, that weighed the evidence, and very often these were political decisions. So oftentimes a triumph would be awarded for the not very impressive achievements of one general, while the very impressive achievements of another but less well-connected general or a more threatening general would not be rewarded. So these generals were really dependent on their peers in the Senate to recognize them, and there was a lot of campaigning behind the scenes to decide who got a triumph. And the generals were actually forced to wait outside the city, outside the pomerium, this boundary of the city, with their armies to decide, to await the response of the Senate to determine whether they got a triumph or not. So they were left just waiting out there. They couldn't come back into the city because in order to cross the pomerium, they had to lay down their powers, at which point they were no longer a general. They no longer had imperium. So there was a lot of campaigning to decide who got a triumph, and sometimes generals were forced to stay for months and months outside the pomerium. So, you know, sort of in the outskirts of Rome. So we have lots of examples of this in ancient history where the Senate stalls, oftentimes because they feel threatened by a general and don't want to give him the glory of a triumph. The triumphal procession was glorious. It included a number of different participants, prisoners, including, hopefully, your enemy, the opposing general. In the case of Jugurtha, this happens, where Jugurtha is captured through the treachery of the king of Mauritania, and so he is able to be transported back to Rome and paraded in Marius's triumph. Oftentimes the generals themselves commit suicide, their leading commanders commit suicide, precisely so that they can't be put on such a display. But other prisoners of war aren't so lucky, so they get paraded and then are generally killed after the triumph. War booty is brought out, so the general wants to show all of the material goods that he was able to seize from the inhabitants of whatever communities he triumphed over. So the war booty can take the form of precious metals, gems, other kinds of material goods. Posters would be made, plaques of different sorts, oftentimes painted on wood, and these plaques would illustrate key episodes in the general's victory, the victory for which he is being awarded a triumph. And so bringing to the spectators the experience of a narrative version in pictures of the general's triumph over whatever population, and showing kind of the important moments, the highlight reel, as it were. The general himself would be dressed in gold and purple, so in the colors of the monarchy, of the king. And he rode in a 4-horse chariot. This was what Jupiter rode in. And he was made up to look like Jupiter. He had his face rubbed with red coloring. This was a kind of deliberate imitation of the monarch and of the ancient monarchy that's being enacted in very closed circumstances where it's not threatening. There's not a concern exactly that the general is going to then go out and think that he's king. But it allows him, for that brief moment of triumph, to connect himself with the Roman kings. In particular, to connect himself with Jupiter, who was the king of the gods. But just in case that general gets any ideas and starts getting too big for his britches, also part of the triumph was this very interesting ritual where the general's troops, as well as the spectators, were permitted to shout curses at him, to say all kinds of nasty things about him, his family, his mother. You can imagine the sorts of things they say. Sex was involved, generally sex with animals, sex with mothers, things like that. Rude curses ruled the day. And the idea here was not just to remind the triumphing general that he was a human just like everybody else and was subject to this kind of abuse, but it was also a celebration of this key component of the Republic, which was libertas, or free speech, liberty. This is what Brutus defended when he established the Republic. And by allowing this kind of free speech to be used towards somebody as glorious as the military general, who is dressed like a king, it's a reminder of that transition from monarchy to republic. And it's a reminder of the centrality of free speech in the Republic. However much this wasn't really a reality, and that it wasn't in fact the case that people of much lower classes were given free speech, that it was a true democracy, there's still at least the pretense and the enactment of Rome as a place where anybody can say anything to anybody. That's what the Republic is about. Generals also used this time of triumph and the aftermath of the procession itself to engage in building projects. This was the time when they used some of their accumulated wealth to build the temples that they had vowed to the gods. So when they were on the battlefield the night before a big battle, making sacrifices and promising things to the gods if they emerged victorious, well, now, after the triumph, is the time when they have to follow through on those promises, when they need to deliver. And so they build elaborate temples to various gods in commemoration of their victories. So even in doing so, certainly it's a monument to the god himself or herself, but it connects that general with the god. And so the general is still being celebrated in a permanent monument. The other kind of permanent monument that we see is, or permanent victory monument, is the victory arch and the column that documents the general's victory. So here's an example of one of these triumphal arches in Orange in France. If you go to the Roman Forum, you will see several: the Arch of Titus, the Arch of Constantine. There were others that stood in ancient Rome and up through late antiquity. But these triumphal arches also stand around the Roman Empire, or territories that were once ruled by Rome. And clearly, they're a reminder of a general's victory, not just for a Roman audience, but for provincials everywhere. And so generals would build these arches all over Roman territory in order to enhance their prestige. And it's meant to be both a passageway for future generals on their triumph. So a kind of, in that triumphal procession of future generals, there's also a reminder of a previous general's triumph. But also they document in an artistic way, but in a permanent monument, the victory. So whereas the procession was ephemeral, this monument, the Triumphal Arch, lasts forever, ideally. And certainly several of these have lasted for 1,500 years or longer. So, you know, what we would have is scenes depicting sacrifices made, so the general being devout. We would have scenes of conflict, scenes of taking slaves, all the different kinds of scenes that one would expect from a military campaign. And somebody, a spectator, can come and look at those scenes, and in looking at them, be reminded of that particular general's victory. And these would have been really elaborate monuments, nicely decorated with marble, with occasionally gold paint, silver paint, things like that. So they really stood out. For us now, they're just stone, but in their original form, they were really beautiful, striking monuments. Another kind of monument that's less usual is the column, and we have here a very famous case of Trajan's column, which stands in Rome in the Forum. And what you have here is the scenes of Trajan's victory over the Dacians being documented in the scenes that wind, the panels that wind up the column. And this would have been then topped with a statue of Trajan himself. So similar to the arch in that it's permanent, the artistic panels are showing scenes of conquering, and it's meant as a reminder to an audience of that general's victory. And it's a kind of way of keeping that victory alive.